Hi, I'm Randy Horton. I lead solutions and partnerships at Orthogonal. First of all, thank you to all of you for joining today. We all know you're very busy, and we appreciate and don't take for granted at all that you're taking an hour out of your day to join us. I want to thank Kay and the awesome team at Matter for organizing this event. We've been partnering at Orthogonal with Matter since before they even opened their doors back in 2015. And I think as today's webinar illustrates, this continues to be a great collaboration. A very quick bit about us. So we're a consulting firm that specializes in software development for regulated medical devices. We got into this space because we believe in improving patient outcomes faster. And the way we accomplish that is by accelerating the development of software as a medical device, digital therapeutics, and connected medical device systems. And that acceleration comes from the fusion of modern software engineering and product development tools and techniques with the traditional safety and compliance requirements of medical devices. The topic that our two speakers will be covering today, the regulation of software as a medical device in the US, really ties back to the challenge of how do we improve patient outcomes faster with better SaMD sooner. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bernhard and Clay, if you can both please introduce yourselves.
So I'll start. I'm Bernhard Kappe, the founder and CEO of Orthogonal, have been in software development for a very long time and found my way into the medical device space about 12 years ago now, and have been working on how do we apply sort of modern best practices within the regulatory framework that we have with all of the changes that we have. Clay and I actually met maybe 5 years ago or so doing a bunch of work for Google, and we've been collaborating on standards, on projects, and lively debates on the ways that the regulations can be applied to SaMD for a while.
Hi, everyone. As Bernhard said, I'm Clay Anselmo. I've been around a long time, more than 30 years in the medical device industry in a variety of roles, but mostly in quality and regulatory. And a lot of my specialties include software-based medical devices, whether it's SaMD, AI/ML products, innovative mobile products. I've taken hundreds of products through the FDA submission process, and I'm one of these weird birds that does both quality systems work and regulatory affairs, regulatory submissions work, and have been, as Bernhard said, partnering with Orthogonal for a few years on interesting projects. So happy to be here today, and thanks everyone for attending.
Awesome. So let's get started, right? So our agenda here is really, why is SaMD challenging as opposed to regular medical devices? Setting the framework in terms of what today's regulatory context is and kind of the pathways in the US for SaMD, and then given what we know of the context and the pathways and the challenges, what are some key insights and best practices that you can apply if you are building SaMD? And then we've got some reference materials at the end. I believe that Matter's going to share the presentation afterwards, so you'll have those available as well. So why is SaMD challenging? Bottom line is really that the regulations and the standards, all of the paradigms were formed quite some time ago, over 30 years ago, when agile software development wasn't a thing. Software wasn't actually that big of a part of most medical devices, which also meant that you had really full control over change, or much fuller control over change. And it was also expensive and time consuming to get real world data. What's happened over that time outside of the medical device space, and then also now in the medical device space, is the concept of software eating the world, that basically software is becoming more and more important, and that eventually software, almost everything becomes software. And we've seen that in lots of the world, but we're definitely seeing that also now in the medical device space. Whereas before, maybe not that much software in a medical device, now there's a lot more software in medical devices. And sometimes medical device software isn't just in a medical device. It could be also on a mobile phone, or also in the cloud, or the medical device spans all of those things. And the next problems that we're facing now is then the interoperability of these various medical devices, maybe integrating your medical device that is a mobile app that is sitting now inside someone else's telemedicine application. And how are you dealing with AI and ML algorithms that maybe can adaptively learn? These are all things that pose new challenges for the regulations, the standards, and frankly, everyone in the industry as to how do we adapt the regulations, how do we deal with these new things within the regulations, and ultimately, how do we keep patients safe, make sure the devices are effective, but also be able to adapt to the change that is happening around us. Clay, let me turn it over to you in terms of the context.
All right. So this is a little complicated, right? We have a very short period of time today to discuss a complicated matter. And in about 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to try to condense sort of what's happening with SaMD products, how the regulators look at them, and what are still the route to markets that apply to all medical devices, and in particular SaMD products, right? So let's remind everybody that an SaMD, when we say that, we mean that the device definition from a regulatory perspective does not include hardware. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that in fact, it doesn't mean that the software doesn't run on hardware. Obviously it does, but that hardware in an SaMD context is a commercial computing platform, not a custom piece of hardware with special features, special electronics that are necessary in order for that software to run. All right, so we draw the definition for SaMD around just the software itself. Now, of course, SaMD products have external interfaces, right? But in this context, those external interfaces are not within the device definition. All right. So what is happening globally as it relates to SaMD products? A lot. And I'd say FDA in particular has really done a nice job of trying to figure out how best to accommodate this emerging technologies within their existing regulatory framework and their legal framework. And that is often a difficult thing, right? Many of the laws that govern this haven't changed substantially in a really long time. So FDA's, with the help of new regulation and a lot of new guidance, has done their best to adapt to products that are substantially different than we had in the 70s, 80s, even 90s, okay? Some of the key things that have occurred at the FDA are things like the FDA's Digital Center of Excellence, which is a resource for you to understand how FDA is thinking about software as a medical device. They launched a few years ago this software pre-certification pilot, which is still a pilot, but was a program to look at how the FDA might use other pathways or the combination of information about a manufacturer and their quality system to certify the manufacturer to reduce the burden in the pre-market process. And that pilot is still underway, but today it's not available for additional participation unless something has changed just recently that I'm unaware of. Of course, there's go back one more, please.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's a lot of new guidance documents out there and guidance documents that have been changing, especially in the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. There's specific guidance for SaMD that I'd suggest that you review. It does a nice job. These documents do a nice job of sort of how do you tackle the fact that there's no hardware when preparing a 510K, when applying design controls. How do you do things like agile development in a medical device design control environment? There's a lot of help out there available for you. Evolving policies, especially in the artificial intelligence machine learning space, right? This is really new. There's a bunch of devices that have been cleared or approved with this technology, but that doesn't mean that we have a lot of guidance around how to best apply current frameworks to these types of products. But there are some position papers. There have been some basic guidance documents that give you an idea of FDA's thinking about these types of products, especially in the computer-aided diagnostics CAD-E, CAD-X frameworks, okay? And then when we think about SaMD and this isolated piece of software, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, but we have all these interfaces, right? We have the hardware interfaces, we might have other software interfaces, we might have interfaces to cloud computing, depending upon the nature of the application, the mobile computing platform. So this idea that software, the definition is just the software, but doesn't mean that you have completely absolved yourself for managing the first tier dependencies of your device, right? And this idea of interconnectivity and interoperability is really key to ensuring that an SaMD device continues to operate the way it's intended and safely over its life cycle, okay? And so as you start to think about SaMD products, this idea of what do they interface with and what are those interfaces effect on the product become really crucial for proving safety or effectiveness or proving substantial equivalency. Okay, next slide. There are lots of misconceptions about SaMD, and I just wanted to take a few of them and make sure that our paradigm is aligned, right? First, the new guidance documents don't drastically deviate from established regulatory principles and practices. Mostly, they map new technologies onto existing processes. It doesn't mean that they don't often have new hooks in the processes or some minor pathway differences, but don't expect until we have, in the US, until we have a major change in the regulation, or in some cases even the law, that the pathways themselves are going to be dramatically different, okay? They are not, there's not a completely new paradigm here, okay? This idea that hardware and software are easily separated is a tough one, okay? I think oftentimes people just say, well, I want to make my product an SaMD, without contemplating that really the architecture of your product dictates whether or not you can separate the hardware from the software. At the point that the hardware becomes customized in a certain way that is necessary for your device to fulfill its intended purpose, it often becomes impossible to separate that hardware from the software. And I would encourage you not to just want to do SaMD for SaMD's sake, right? There can be some advantages, but you certainly don't want to sacrifice functionality or safety of your product by trying to separate the hardware and the software. It's just simply, it's a matter of architecture, whether or not SaMD is a legitimate pathway for you, okay? It also doesn't mean that you don't have to control to some degree, the mobile computing platform that you are operating on, right? It isn't typically a good practice to just say, my application, my SaMD runs on Apple, okay? It runs on Apple iOS. Well, Apple iOS changes a lot. Oftentimes the iPhone changes in hardware configuration, it changes in software configuration. How do you make sure that your device will always run on the hardware that it's intended to run on? And those are some difficult to answer questions with SaMD products, right? I guess the last one here is this idea that if I say I'm an SaMD and I take the SaMD pathway, I'm going to substantially cut my time to market. And I don't think that is, that the data bears out that this is true. It doesn't mean that there aren't differences, and that in some cases, because you don't have hardware components, there are elements of design control that won't apply to those things. But it isn't like there is, oh my gosh, there is a 15-day clearance process for all SaMD products at the FDA. That isn't how it works. these products still flow through substantially the same pre-market approval processes, pre-market clearance processes we've had for quite a long time. Okay.
The one thing I would add to that, right? One of the promises of the pre-cert program was that there would be, for lower risk SaMD, a streamlined process of doing of actually getting clearance and or not necessarily even needing clearance for certain changes. And so we were all excited about that, and a lot of the things in there were very I certainly thought were good ideas that I think a lot of people in the software area were welcoming. Unfortunately, where it is right now, the FDA doesn't really have the regulatory authority to implement the pre-cert program that is somehow going through Congress, and I am not a professional lobbyist or, Congress tea leaf reader to know what the actual likelihood of that coming through over the next few years is. But basically, right now, there aren't any, that streamlined approach is really not there.
Yeah, and look, Bernhard's right. I mean, there are some promising future potential programs that could. I want to make sure that we're all realistic, right? It isn't a magic bullet to say you're an SaMD product and you're going to get to the market in some supremely shortened fashion. Okay. I am going to talk a little bit about some exemptions and some changes in the 21st Century Cures Act that do provide existing pathways, but exemptions that put certain SaMD products that weren't available to go in that pathway previously and now can. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Let's keep going. Okay, so this 21st Century Cures Act was a change to law that actually took some software products and reduced the regulatory burden for certain software products. Okay, and without going into a lot of detail, FDA has always had exemptions for certain low-risk products. They call them Class 1 devices, and they've had this category that they call enforcement discretion for quite some time. And then there are products that perform certain health-related functions that are not regulated devices. So we have these exempt products. We have products that are under enforcement discretion. We have products that are Class 1 that some don't require a 510K, a pre-market clearance. They're 510K exempt. In the 21st Century Cures Act, FDA changed some of the classifying rules definitions and moved some things that were devices before into not a device. Some things that were in Class 1 into enforcement discretion, and kind of move the categories around. So if you looked at a particular product in intended use quite a long time ago, some of those rules have changed, and it might be worth taking another look at what the classification of some of those products are. Okay, some have been moved into not a device, and some have been moved into enforcement discretion. Okay, I will tell you that still, I mean, if you do require pre-market clearance, the standard 510K, 510K de novo PMA pathways still apply. Okay, and while there are pilot programs, and FDA has done a nice job of continuing to introduce pilot programs for things they want to try out. There are some for orphan, small population types of products. There are shortened pathways for those where there's an unmet emerging need. So those are not SaMD specific, but there are special programs. I just want to be sure that that you realize that whenever a new program comes out, it doesn't mean that it's immediately available. It doesn't mean that it dramatically shortens everything initially, right? It takes time for regulators to get familiar with new programs. It takes time for pilot programs to roll out to the general public. So just be cautiously optimistic as it comes to SaMD products and what the future might hold. And today, understand that they generally flow through the common regulatory pathways in the US that you're used to. Okay, next slide. What does it mean in practice? Here's what I want you to take away from this. Timing and submission content expectations are the same or increased for new technologies. And I'm pointing specifically to AI/ML. There are additional things that have to be contemplated for AI/ML products, and many of them have what are called special controls guidance documents, which mean they went through a de novo process typically, and that there are additional things that have to be considered in your pre-market submission to the agency, okay? Many times clinical studies, all right? I often hear, well, what's this de novo process? Is the de novo process a short process? The de novo is a risk-based classification process. And while it can be short, there's a lot of upfront work in the de novo process to discuss with the FDA what the special controls need to be, how to structure your pre-mark submission, if you need clinical studies. And what that means is for a de novo process, the total time to market from the time you start engaging with the regulator till you get clearance is longer than a traditional 510K, okay? And you don't really get to choose. A de novo is for products where there's no predicate that would normally be a class 3 PMA, but represent low risk. And it's basically requesting that FDA classify it, instead of automatically putting it in class 3, put it in class 2 and allow a 510K without a predicate device, okay? It's an involved interactive process with the agency, okay? And again, clinical data for 510K products continues to grow. This has kind of been the trend for a while, and it continues to be the trend, especially for new technologies, right? So keep that in mind.
One thing I just to add on to that, right, on the de novo front, just because you're de novo isn't as if you basically get to sort of like, I own this category. As soon as there is a new product code, someone else can do a 510K and use you as a reference. So you're the first one through the gate, but everyone else's job is much, much easier after that. And on the clinical data, right, I think at some point there was a statistic that on average 510Ks, something around, 10% of 510Ks required, some kind of a clinical trial or a clinical data validation as opposed to bench validation. In what you've seen for more innovative and SaMD products, I won't hold you to this number, but what are you seeing in terms of, percentage requiring more clinical evidence?
Well, I think for de novo products, I think it's a very high percentage of de novo products require clinical data. And let's be clear, clinical data isn't always prospective, randomized control arm study. But it's data gathered on human subjects. Sometimes it can be retrospective, sometimes it's prospective, sometimes it's a confirmatory study, sometimes it's a control study. We sort of lump them all into this bucket of clinical data, but emerging technologies without a predicate, the vast majority, I think, require human clinical data. As far as others, that are not AI, look, the newer the technology, the higher the percentage of those devices that require clinical data. My perception is a little biased because I don't often do sort of standard vanilla 510K submissions. So I would say for me, better than 50% of the 510Ks that I work on require human clinical data. Okay. All right, so let's keep going. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a refresher, right? The categories of devices fit into sort of three main buckets. Not a device, right? So there are a number of types of healthcare related applications that FDA does not consider regulated medical devices. If you're in this category, basically none of the framework of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the ancillary regulations and guidance documents apply to you, okay? There are devices that FDA calls enforcement discretion, which means that FDA believes they have authority to regulate these devices as medical devices, but is choosing not to at this time because they perceive the risk to be low, okay? And enforcement discretion is a category where very much like not a device at this time, FDA believes FDA is not applying any of the requirements of the FDA&C. They do have some recommendations, but they're not requirements, okay? Class 1 devices, which are lowest risk regulated devices, and they have a couple of different categories of exemptions in Class 1 devices. Many of them do not require a 510K or what we call a pre-market notification. Some of those devices are also exempt from the GMP, the good manufacturing practices, what we often call the quality, what's called the quality system regulation. And some are exempt from both. It really depends, but there is a nice, easy to use database from FDA that can help you locate the classification of your device and understand if it's exempt, okay? There are some Class 1 devices that require 510K, okay? Class 2 devices, moderate risk, they generally require 510K. There are a few of Class 2 devices that are 510K exempt, not very many. Most Class 2 devices, 510K, and you can think of these as their review and clearance process from the time you submit the 510K to you get clearance generally runs between about 90 days and 270 days. Yes, of course, there are a few that are shorter. Yes, of course, there are a few that are sometimes longer, but that kind of bell curve sits in between 90 and 270 days for most products, okay? If your device has clinical data, it's gonna be to the longer end of that most likely, okay? Because you're more likely to get questions, more complex questions from the agency, okay? Think of Class 2 510K products as being Me Too type submissions. You have to have a predicate device, meaning a device that is substantially similar in intended use and in technology, and you're showing that your device is equivalent, substantially equivalent, okay? That's the concept. Keep going.
Just a little housekeeping. We have a lot of Q&A questions. We will be taking questions at the end of this. So I think there are about 15 to 20 minutes for questions, and then there's a half hour sort of breakout rooms afterwards. So we will be getting to a lot of these questions afterwards, at least the ones we haven't answered during the presentation.
Okay, so I mentioned de novo before. De novo is a type of 510K, but it is a 510K without a predicate for devices that would normally have automatically been put into Class 3 high risk, but because of their intended use, FDA says, no, we agree, we think these can be Class 2, and they have this thing called special controls, which are basically an outline of the types of testing and data that you have to supply in your 510K in order to use this pathway. And as Bernhard said, there are no protections. Once you do the de novo, everybody after you gets to do a traditional 510K, but they do have to follow the special controls guidance document. So whatever you did to get your product on the market, basically whatever you did is what other people have to do, and it's enforced in the form of special controls, okay? Class 3 PMA devices, okay, if you don't have a predicate, the default is that you go into Class 3, okay? It's called the automatic Class 3 designation, and that is the sort of highest tier of market application that the FDA has. It requires you to prove safety and effectiveness. It requires clinical studies. It's a significant process. The PMA process, again, if you drew the bell curve, is something like a year to 5 years, depending upon the pathway. That's not the review time. Let me be clear. We're talking about sort of total time. Unfortunately, we often tend to focus just on the FDA's review clock rather than on the total time. The clock stops when questions get answered, and you have to go out and gather data and then resubmit the information. And so the total time from submission to approval or from submission to clearance is often much longer than just the review times by the agency. Okay. And if you've got a fundamental new technology and there's no predicate, if it doesn't look like you're going to get qualify for a de novo, you're going to be in this bucket and you're going to have to prove safety and effectiveness. Okay. Those are the major pathways that are present today in the US. There are others. There are, for special populations, there are special programs, emergency use authorizations, like we've seen with diagnostics in the COVID area, and there are a few others, okay? But there's no way we can get into those today. Next slide.
All right, so, basically the regulations and standards are there. There are some new things and some new classifications. I think there's a lot of things that are out there in terms of that where there are guidance documents that have been created that are helpful to help navigate certain things, or draft guidance documents that are out there. So, for example, the FDA has guidance documents on interoperability. So if you're interoperating two medical devices, what are the ways that you can go about doing that? There's also guidance around multiple function devices. So what happens if you have something that is both a medical device or has medical device functionality in it, but a whole bunch of other things that are not medical device functionality? So, for example, one of the examples in the guidance is you have a dermatology app that is sitting on a mobile phone and uses the smartphone camera and goes through, and some pretty good illustrations of how they want to treat those types of things. So some of the guidance, and we mentioned a little bit later in terms of things to look at, is very helpful in terms of that. They keep coming up with new guidance, but for example, right now there is no AI specific guidance in force. There is a position paper and there's a draft guidance on good machine learning practices. Those are all things that are helpful in terms of your framework for navigating these things. Similarly, there are, I think, standards and guidance documents that are produced by standards bodies that the FDA has recognized. So things like ISO 13485, which is also used or referenced by the EU, IEC 62304, which is around software life cycle processes, and then ISO AMI TIR 45 on the application of agile practices within 62304 are all very useful things to look at. These are all things that we rely on as we are thinking about building out medical device products, as at least ways of thinking about it that the FDA has accepted and that we can use potentially as some of the arguments for that, right? There are a couple of things to think about it in terms of the regulatory pathways. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So, in some cases, you may have something that where you could say, I could choose to have this as a service and be non-regulated, or maybe it's class 1. In other cases, it's really clear, no, this has to be regulated, right? This depends on your claims. It depends on the patient safety, but especially for very low risk things. This is a debate that often people in the digital therapeutics realm have. You want to be careful on those things, that you aren't actually sort of treating something that has to be a medical device as not a medical device. But you do have, if you aren't making claims and there aren't patient risks associated with it, a lot of freedoms that you have to iterate and improve, and it's much lower cost than trying to do that within a medical device. So there are companies in the digital therapeutics space, especially before they go do a clinical trial, they will do a pilot first. Again, because they're very low risk, and then they go into a clinical trial, use the clinical trial evidence as part of their FDA clearance. Akili is an example of a company that has done that successfully. One of the reasons for these very low risk things where you might want to get clearance, even though you may be able to run something as a service without that, is it is easier to get reimbursement, and as a startup to get valuation around that. The second thing I would say here is that your first regulatory filing isn't the end, especially if you're doing software. Things are going to be changing. You're going to learn new things. There's going to be new, potentially new features, new value, new integrations that are going to be coming out there. So thinking about this not as a one-time, here we're done, but more of a roadmap of where you may be going. So, maybe you have a roadmap where down the line you're going to have some really fantastic, amazing claims. But maybe you don't do that in your first FDA clearance. You get something that is less lesser claims, but easier to get through the FDA, and then you add more claims as you go through the process. That is often a faster way to get to market, and often a cheaper way to get to market, because if you come with really big claims, the FDA is going to say, you're going to have to do a really big study to show this. So a lot of this is about realizing that if you're in SaMD, you're in software, things change quickly, you can get a lot of data quickly. So you need to think about this as an ongoing process in terms of speed and efficiency. Clay, do you have any comments on this one?
I think you hit the most of it, Bernhard. I was actually trying to answer questions in the chat while you were doing this.
Got it. Okay, sounds good. So there's the theme here is change and responding to change, right? So you have the ability to change quickly. You have the ability to collect a lot more data out in the market, but very often in SaMD, you are also dealing with a changing ecosystem, potentially changing reimbursement models, and the underlying things that you are working on top of, mobile, consuming data from other devices, cloud computing, all of the platforms underneath and things you might integrate in with are changing rapidly. And so how do you deal with all of these changes? I think the first one we already started talking about a little bit is the regulatory architecture. In general, it's not a one-shot, get it out there. This is a longer journey of a series of 510Ks or interrelating regulatory filings as well. If you want to see how that kind of thing might progress, one of our clients, PhysIQ, has a whole series of 510Ks that they have evolved over time, where they are complementary things, but really start simple, extend to something new, and then you are in a world where acquiring data and the ability to use that data is much, much less expensive than it used to be 20, 30 years ago, right? It was very expensive to get data. Nowadays, you can get that data, you can capture things automatically, and you have the ability to use that data to prove and improve things. One of the things the FDA has been sort of actively trying to promote is the use of real-world data. So obviously, they care about real-world data in terms of safety and effectiveness, and they'd much rather have real world data than just something you did in a clinical trial. So they're actively trying to do that. But at the same time, On the carrot side of it, the ability to potentially use real world data to reinforce your claims or potentially be able to make some new differential claims as well. So thinking about how are you going to capture this data, what does your data case management look like? These are all things that can help you evolve in a more streamlined fashion and maybe not have to do expensive clinical trials along the way, and protect yourself in terms of post-market surveillance when you're not the only person or only company that can collect data on what's going on in the real world with your products. The third one is just, honestly, a lot of this is good software development practices, right? Thinking about modular architecture in terms of your software, drawing the lines of where is the edge of your medical device and what things are outside of your medical device. But even for the things that are outside of your medical device, where do you have dependencies that might create risk within your medical device? And how do you manage those things, right? So there are a bunch of things in IEC 62304 in particular around software segregation and things in multiple function device and cybersecurity and in interoperability guidance that you can use in terms of thinking about how you might architect your system. Instrumenting this and having automation around these things makes it a lot easier to assess the impact of change, to be able to monitor these different components and changes within those, especially for things that are outside of your control, so that you are spending less time trying to catch up with with the changes. What you want to be able to do is actually monitor and already have mitigations in place for change. Another one is kind of the quality DevOps approach, really thinking about your end-to-end product lifecycle, not just in terms of your software development lifecycle and your traditional CI/CD release pipelines as what you're using for value creation, but also taking a DevOps approach and thinking about the other processes in terms of speed and efficiency and quality as well. So user experience, human factors, risk analysis, design controls, automating that and integrating that into your DevOps process is a way of actually both increasing safety and increasing compliance while shortening your time frame. That involves a lot of tooling, a lot of automation, a lot of good architecture and metadata around those things. But if you're doing something where you're going to have a lot of change, and especially things where there may be releases that you need to do in between regulatory filings, you're still going to have to keep your design controls up to speed. Investing in those things can have a dramatic effect on how quickly you can do that and how much money you spend on design controls. Especially in there's a lot of SaMD that is patient facing or that has significant interfaces. So thinking about user experience and human factors as part of that process is super important in these areas. There are some where it's totally headless, there is no user interface, and so maybe that's not the case. But very often, if you've got a mobile app that's patient facing and you've got algorithms that are part of that, and that is part of your class 2 device, there's a lot of potential for use errors and other issues around that. So really think about the same things that you would be doing outside of the medical device space, right? Where people use things like 3 user Thursdays, lean UX, et cetera, fast feedback loops, if you can do that kind of frequent testing and extend that to use errors and human factors, you're going to get a higher quality product much faster. The other thing you can do in SaMD, and actually you can do this with SIMD too, as long as you have outside connectivity, is to integrate product analytics into that. So that way you are not only doing qualitative testing with sessions with users, you're also seeing how the product is being used out in the market, and use that quantitative data both for post-market surveillance, but then also as a way to potentially improve your product and things like that. And that's it. We could go on and on about kind of the best practices, but those are kind of the greatest hits, the highest level things.
Clay, you've been answering a bunch of questions. So why don't I suggest you take some of the ones you think that might have broader applicability and throw a few out for you and Bernhard to address. Our apologies to everybody. We don't have time to address these all. Happy to show up for a follow-up session to answer questions.
There was a really good question about risk management and its application to continuous learning algorithms. And so I am actually unaware of any approved or cleared continuous learning algorithms on the market today. All of the ones I know about or I've dealt with are all locked. And what that means is that at the time you release it, it does not continuously learn. You may retrain it with additional real world data and then re-release another version, but that's treated as a software change. It might require, in fact, many cases, it requires a new 510K. So the application of risk management doesn't really change with a non-continuously evolving algorithm. You treat it like a new release and you analyze the changes. You do bench testing to prove that the sensitivity or specificity or whatever the performance measures stay the same. So it doesn't create sort of a new paradigm for risk management. I don't know of any, and I've not seen anybody in the regulatory world do risk management on one of these continuously learning algorithms, but it will be something that we have to face in the future. I can think of some ways that might be done, but it's going to be an interesting paradigm for sure.
Yeah, obviously the FDA has gotten, in particular in the radiology space, right, where you have the sort of clinician in the loop, and that being sort of the radiologist analyzing images as the gold standard, right? If that's in the loop, you're getting data that can help you potentially train and do continuous online learning. So that was the idea of the position paper, to answer that and provide a framework for that. But you're right. I haven't seen anything where this has actually gone into practice, and there is no. That's some of the guidance that people are waiting on. Is sort of like, okay, can we do this? But so far, I haven't seen that either. I think that guidance. That position paper has an interesting framework on how you might want to think about that, even if you are doing offline learning and then periodically doing updates. There's really some good work in there in terms of the kinds of things you would need to do, and you could potentially talk to the FDA about, in terms of, here's how we think this is going to change, and these are the types of things we are going to put into updates without filing a new 510K. So having kind of an understanding with the FDA of kind of the bounds of what you're going to do. As far as the risk management, yeah, there are a number of ways that people are thinking about that. Again, it's how can you bound where how the sort of where this could go off the rails, right? And how do you bound with where an AI algorithm might be playing, right? What's the worst that could happen, and so have a failover from that and detection where the AI algorithm might go out. Easier said than done, and it's going to be very much of a case by case basis. But nothing that I've seen is sort of like shown that the theories and the ways we're thinking about it is something that's actually gotten there yet.
Here's a good one.
Yeah.
Is there any special treatment required for AI/ML-based SaMD, which changes over time due to changes in ML models? What kind of special documentation is required for such products? Okay, so
That's the same problem set, really, right?
similar. I guess the comment I wanted to make here is that I think often people believe that there are such things as sort of small changes to ML models. And yes, there might be, but if you're contemplating sort of retraining with a new data set, right? The nature of training an ML model and a multi-fold sort of cross-validation approach, and what you get is not often an incremental iteration on what you did before. And so it's very hard to make the case that some small subset of your testing can be repeated, and that would be enough to support another approval or another clearance, depending upon the class of product by the agency. And so FDA has contemplated the use of what they call a standalone performance assessment, which it's kind of in between bench and clinical, right? Where you gather images and demographic information and metadata from the real world. You gather clinical data, you apply your ML, and you get some output, right? And you do that with the old algorithm, and you do that with the new algorithm on the same data set, and you compare their performance for things like sensitivity, specificity, accuracy, whatever, right? And if you can demonstrate that you have had improvement on a representative data set of your intended use population, you may be able to avoid doing a prospective clinical study. Okay, that's part of what standalone performance assessments are for. But it's right now, I know of no framework to say retraining is not a 510K, and retraining can be done with pure bench testing and cleared with pure bench testing. I'm sure there might be an exception to that somewhere, but my experience with these products has not been that. Okay, and the way the guidance reads, the CAT-E guidance that talks about this as it relates to radiological products, really sort of puts this in a context of it's on you to prove to the agency what the data is required to show substantial equivalence.
I think there's a set around kind of comparing EU MDR and FDA regulations, in particular around, kind of clinical evaluation requirements.
Paradigms for clinical evaluation in Europe under MDD, the original regulation, or the original directive, let's say regulation, and under the MDR are substantially different. The bar is going up substantially. The concepts behind clinical evaluation in EU do not have an exact corollary in the US. In 510Ks, the vast majority of 510Ks do not require pre-market a clinical trial, a clinical evaluation in this context, okay? Some 510Ks, around 10%, the last time I saw data, it was around 10%, do require a clinical study. That is not exactly a clinical evaluation is in the European context, right? PMA products often require multiple clinical studies, what we would call sort of pilot and pivotal studies, or feasibility and pivotal studies, which are intended to demonstrate full safety and effectiveness. In Europe, there's more of a sliding scale, right? And you're allowed to some degree to leverage clinical information that you gather on from publications, whatever, on related products to you that use similar technology, similar intended use, and then pair that with your own clinical data
or your own prospective clinical trials. And depending upon risk, you build a case for why your clinical evaluation supports that your product meets its intended purpose and is safe. Okay, that's a really simple summary of a really complex topic. But one thing I want to say for everyone is under the MDR, which is new and just being implemented, the bar is going up substantially for the number of products you're going to require clinical data to support their initial CE mark. Okay.
Yeah, MDD was sort of easier and less rigorous than FDA regulations, and MDR is in most cases a higher bar than FDA. So
the days of saying that CE was much easier do not exist, are not likely to exist under MDR.
Yep.
Lovely. All right. I would like to thank you all for presenting for us today, and have a great rest of your afternoon.